Thank you, Sandra, and thank you once again for hosting me this week.
You're welcome. We do want to start by asking you the implications of government insisting that tallow oil pay the tax.
My understanding, based on what I've been reading in the press, is that tallow oil was actually willing to pay the tax, which was $167 million. But the reason why the transaction collapsed was because CNOC and Total could not agree with government regarding how they would treat the acquisition costs of this farm down transaction. So I think if the transaction comes again back on table, tallow oil, I don't know whether they will withdraw their offer of taxes, but it wasn't in dispute.
Is there really a middle ground between the government and these oil companies?
I think one of the issues which has been raised by oil companies is that even if they were to pay the tax on the farm down, it's not levied in good faith, because they are insisting the reason tallow oil has diluted stake in its oil licenses is to be able to raise financing to fund the next phase of the oil and gas project. So if tallow oil needs $900 million, and out of that $900 million, you take 30% of that, they still have to go elsewhere and get the money. So they are saying, why not tax profits? Why should you tax investment? Because this is the money that is earmarked for investment in the sector. And if I were on the side of the government, I would interrogate further and understand whether indeed this money is going to be invested in the oil and gas sector. I would even work towards getting a commitment from them, because if indeed this money is going to be spent in the oil and gas sector, you're shooting yourself in the foot, taxing capital earmarked for investment.
It is now believed that tallow oil does not want to pay the tax, and would like to understand from your own opinion, do you think if they actually don't pay the tax, it would affect future, infrastructure developments and negotiations between these companies and then the government?
The bottom line is that you need to get an agreement between the government and the oil companies regarding the ongoing tax dispute if the current standstill in Uganda's oil and gas industry is to be resolved. Because if tallow is diluting stake, people are going to get different shareholdings or interests, and you need to set up a number of companies, like a company which is going to actually hold the pipeline. So without this transaction concluding, the oil industry of Uganda cannot move forward. Yes.
So we also know that the oil tax regime has been revised 7 times. Why do you think this is so?
Indeed, it has been revised 7 times. In 2008, original rules were introduced. They were fairly expansive. But in 2009, there was another amendment. And the reason why there was that amendment, we had a company called Heritage Oil, which was the first company that discovered oil in Uganda. It was anticipated that it was going to divest of its interests and exit Uganda. So if they left at that point in time, the law did not levy capital gains taxes on gains that arose. So the law was amended at that point in time to ensure that gains which arise on a sale of interest, similar to the transaction tallow is running today, should be subject to income tax at the rate of 30%. Then in 2010 and 2011, there were other changes which had a radical adverse impact on Uganda's oil and gas sector. In 2011, VAT, the oil companies started to incur VAT as a cost. And when this was introduced, the oil companies mentioned that it was going to adversely affect the project economics. And over time, following negotiations and engagements with government, we saw another shift in the laws in 2015. And this followed. I remember President Museveni addressed an event at Uganda Chamber of Mines and Petroleum and cautioned government agencies against taxing capital earmarked for investment. His position was that it's prudent actually if you only tax the profits that arises from the capital which has been invested. So that was the main drive of amending the law. Of course, substantially most of the issues were addressed, but there are still gaps within the law which need to be revised to meet the president's aspiration, and some of the disputes we are seeing today actually arise from the gaps which were not addressed by the 2015 amendments.
Oh, very interesting. And maybe you at home who's watching us tonight, you can also join the conversation on our social media platforms by sending us your views on the government insisting that Tullow Oil pay tax on the impending farm down with Total E&P. And maybe to take you back, how did we get to the point where the Tullow Oil farm collapsed?
I understand negotiations and discussions have been ongoing.
Okay.
And the government and the oil companies could not come to a middle ground. If I were in the position of a decision maker, I would try to put issues in context as a means of coming up with a solution. First and foremost, the oil companies are at a point where they're going to invest a lot of money. It is projected that between $10 to $20 billion is going to be spent. Now, to put that in perspective, Uganda's GDP is $30 billion, so the oil companies are going to spend 2/3 of Uganda's GDP. So usually at that point in time, the oil companies are very nervous about making an investment. And before they make an investment, they'll have to be very sure that the tax regime and all the other incentives which have been offered would enable them make a decent economic return. But as soon as they've invested, the bargaining power shifts to the government, because the considerations at that point in time the oil companies are looking at is recovering their investment. And what usually happens all over the world, for you to unlock investment, sometimes you need to dangle carrots, go slow, give in to a lot of what is expected. But once the investment has been made, and if the macro environment changes, like if at the point of investment the oil price is at $50 per barrel, and after investment and production has started, the oil price is at $80 per barrel, the government's force changes. And if there's any technocrat who is watching, I would refer them to the Kazakhstan oil situation. They faced the situation that we had. They had a lot of oil companies, much bigger than Total, but the way they handled it was quite interesting. And over time they were able, once production started, to renegotiate part of the deal, and the oil companies accepted. So we could consider that option as a route. And I also like to give the example of what we learned in history. Sometimes you can lose a battle but go on to win the war. I think where we are.
Interesting. So in this case, should it be the government losing the battle of losing the fact that it won't get that tax and, you know, go on with the construction of the pipeline, or should it just insist and say this time we have to win this battle and get the taxes as well?
If the oil companies position that the imposition of taxes today suppresses economic returns, it is certainly sensible for the government to waive it, because oil companies are representing shareholders back home, and the shareholders could have prescribed that only invest in a project that gives us a return of maybe 20%. But as a result of the tax regime, the return is 15%, which would mean they cannot go on to invest, because if they go on and invest, they will be violating what the shareholders prescribe. So what the government needs to do is to sit down with the oil companies, and the good thing is that it can be an objective discussion. You can look at an economic model, agree on the parameters, and you arrive at a science-based, verifiable economic model, which can actually tell you that as a result of your tax regime, the project investment hurdles are not made. So if the oil regime tax regime is affecting project profitability, as a government I would look into it, and if there's credibility in what the oil companies are saying, I would actually waive it, because if you insist on having it, the project will not move ahead. And again, even if Total or Tullow Oil and Sinopec went and other players came on board, they're going to raise the same issues. They are legitimate commercial concerns.
So in your opinion,
yes,
Mr. Dennis, you believe the government should waive off the tax?
What the government needs to do is sit down with the oil companies again, because what I realize actually is that at this point in time there's a temptation of apportioning blame.
Okay.
Some people are saying the oil companies are bullying the government. Other people are saying the government technocrats are letting down the oil companies. Now that misses the point. The elephant in the room is the oil tax regime. Is it affecting project viability? If the oil companies and government sit down again on the negotiation table and objectively review the impact of the tax regime and come to the conclusion that it's indeed making the project uneconomic, it probably makes sense to waive the tax. But if again they sit down on the table and they review, the science-based review actually establishes that the profit returns are not affected by the tax regime, then the government is right to insist on levying the tax.
And maybe someone would wonder, why should the disagreements between the oil and gas sectors and the government affect all the other people involved? Why should they be affected? Why can negotiations, take part in the background?
I think the reason why everyone gets affected is that this is a big industry, and it's the negotiations that will enable the project to take off, because the oil companies cannot start to invest money until they've come to agreement with the government. But again, not related to this, when you look at a commercial view, there's actually a lot that we lose when this project doesn't go ahead. Based on our internal workings at Crystal Advocates, we established that the government loses about $300 million per year in eroded value of expected cash flows from the project whenever there's every year, whenever there's this delay. Oil companies lose some money, but it's not as big as what the government loses. And the oil companies are also under less financial pressure because they have assets in other countries that are already producing oil and they're generating cash flows. Secondly, if you've been reading in the press, we've seen a number of people laid off by Total and Sino, or even before. And some of them are our peers, colleagues, some of the best brains you've had who have designed the field development plans. They've been laid down. And there are lots of people in Uganda who have started oil and gas, but they cannot be absorbed by the industry because of the standstill we have. Then if you've also been following trends, there's Kabaale International Airport, which is being built with money borrowed from UK. And the reason why it was built is we anticipated that the oil industry would take off in 3 years. Then we've also borrowed money to build the oil roads. So if you borrow money and you set up all this infrastructure in anticipation that it's going to be used for oil and gas activities, and it doesn't happen, you lose out. Then thirdly, fourth, Mozambique has made a final investment decision. Kenya is also on the brink. So if Uganda doesn't move quickly, chances are that the capital is actually going to move to Mozambique, and Kenya and Uganda will lose that. And then also many local businesses which had borrowed heavily to invest to prepare for oil and gas activities are bleeding. Some are on the brink of bankruptcy, or others are already bankrupt.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Dennis Kakembo, for joining us tonight on Talk of the Nation. For now, of course, we'll wait to see how it all plays out, but according to Mr. Dennis, that on several occasions really works in the oil or deals with the oil and gas matters, it is important for the government and the oil companies to sit down and make a proper decision that won't affect both parties. Thank you so much for joining us on Talk of the Nation. Keep it NTV Weekend Edition.
Opinion Poll is brought to you by
KCB. Go ahead. KCB Bank.